It's a pleasure to be here this morning. As you can recognize from my accent, I'm not Norwegian born. I was born and raised in Montreal. I left for Norway 21 years ago for a 6-month trip and then just came back to Canada. I really enjoyed Alex's talk. I think Alex put in perspective a lot of the challenges we have in order to transfer knowledge from science to and apply it with our athletes. It is a topic that I spend a lot of my professional life addressing. I'm going to suggest in my presentation a structure to better understand how we can communicate knowledge and how we may be effective in doing so. And then I'll finish my short presentation this morning in giving an example of how we're doing it in Norway. When we look at knowledge transfer, really the main goal is to make sure that we will end up using this knowledge and either create increases in performance or in pleasure or increased participation. But we have an end goal in mind, and we hope to have an effect with the knowledge production we have and its utilization. When I started my scientific journey around 20 years ago, I remember that we talked about knowledge transfer in those years because there was a study that had just come out studying the path between major discoveries at the academic level and how much time it took before people on the floor started using that knowledge. And the study concluded that for most major findings, it took a time space of between 18 and 20 years. So if you actually think that's a lot of years and perhaps a couple of generations that go through the peak of their career with some knowledge available, but they're not actually using that knowledge to increase their performance. I think there has been some changes over the last 20 years. Technology has changed a lot the speed of transfer of that knowledge, but it has also increased the amount of challenges in terms of how much we can rely on the information that is available. So maybe one first step when we look at knowledge transfer, we can call it diffusion. It's more like a let it happen approach. It refers to a passive process. We have examples, for example, today, when we organize conferences or when we publish peer review publications, even using social media. So we put the knowledge out there, but there's no control as to how that knowledge is used and how effective the change has been. And then a second step would be dissemination and knowledge transfer, more a make it happen approach. Using that approach, we use targeted and tailored data, and the information is transmitted to relevant audiences to increase the uptake of evidence and bridge the research practice gap. Typically, that approach will be used when we have a long-term project, and then we write up a summary of the whole process and the major findings in the end. We have meetings with the major stakeholders and then develop knowledge tools that can be used over and over afterwards. And then the third and last step, and a lot of research agencies, I know it is the case in Canada, it is the case in Great Britain now, and Norway is also following in that direction, using an implementation of science approach, where we use robust scientific methods underpinned by theories, models, and frameworks. But then the first step is to identify research practice gaps, identify support and barriers to the uptake of evidence, design interventions to reduce research practice gaps, evaluate impact of the intervention on educational practices. So each step is much more labor intensive. It needs very competent people at each step of the process, but it will lead to hopefully long-lasting effect in implementation. One of the very important aspects when we look into knowledge transfer from science to the applied world, and Alex has touched upon that in his talk, is the proximity or the overlap between the coach-athlete group and the applied research group. And it is really important that both groups show reciprocal understanding and respect for opportunities and limitations from the world they belong to, but also that they know enough about each other's world and way of seeing the world to appreciate what may be applicable and what may be important to do research on. And then at the bottom of the slide, I wrote just a quote: "It is often better to use one theory to its full potential than get mixed up using 10 different theories." And I think that is a very important thing to remember. So if you were to choose, I know there are a lot of coaches here in the room, if you were to choose like a strategy when you're working with your athletes, I think it would be a very wise advice to follow to use one theory that you feel really good about, like you feel that the theory is very intuitive to you, and go into depth about that theory. Read many articles with different samples in different settings using different methodology, so you really understand the limitations of that theory and when you may be able to apply it in a very efficient way. And actually you're going to get a lot more out of that approach than to actually just brush over 10 different theories and feel that you can use some parts of those theories to answer different questions, but it is likely that you will make big mistakes, because if you only brush over those different theories, it'll be really hard for you to understand the true limitations and opportunities those theories are presenting. And then finally, I'll finish with an example from Norway. So not unlike other countries like Canada, we have a sport confederation. So in Canada, it'd be Sport Canada, that overviews all the different federations. And the Sport Confederation as an organization is built with people in functions that the smaller federations would not be able to have because of limited resources, and they distribute those services to all the different federations of sport. So for example, the Sport Confederation in Norway is responsible to make the template for coaching education, and then coordinate the coaching education between the different sport federations. And then we have the sport federation. But one thing that is really interesting about the sport federations in Norway is all the sport federations have their offices around the national football stadium. So we have the football field in the middle, and then all the sport federations have their offices around the stadium. So if you want to go talk to, for example, you're in the Triathlon Federation and you want to talk to the people from track and field for lunch, it's really easy for you to coordinate that meeting, or just to actually go and get a cup of coffee, because they are literally only 50 meters away from your own office. If you want to talk to the Swimming Federation, or if you want to talk to the Cycling Federation, they're as close to your office as the other federations are. About 750 meters up the hill from all the sport federations, we have an organization called Olympiatoppen. Olympiatoppen is a little bit like On the Podium. Actually, On the Podium has been inspired by Olympiatoppen when they were putting the system in place here in Canada. And Olympiatoppen is sort of an elite sports training center where it's a hub for all the elite sports to meet and to use top sports scientists that are applying science to making the athletes compete at the highest level possible. And then 200 meters from Olympiatoppen, we have the one sports science university Norway has, where we have 100 faculty only doing sports sciences. So all the different sciences that you can find, but of sports, are all in that one building, 200 meters away from the National Training Center. So you could say that's about the resources we have in Norway. We've managed to pool all the resources within a kilometer from each other. It is quite funny that Norway has been so effective at being conscious about the geographical challenges of having people collaborate with each other. Norway is not as big as Canada, but it's definitely challenging terrain to travel through. So, so it is interesting to see that with limited resources, they've made choices that have increased the communication between scientific colleagues and coaches and athletes. And then we have 4 research centers that are funded by the Ministry of Culture, the same ministry that is subsidizing all the sport federations. And they have placed those 4 research centers related to sports sciences in two academic institutions to make sure that there is a transfer between the academic world that is financed by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Culture that is financing sports. And then the last point I wanted to make was we have a very small population in Norway. We like to compete at the highest level on the international scene. We don't have as many people to work with or to have in the different roles as Canada or the US, Australia, South Africa has. So we end up having many people with different roles, with different hats. So it does lead to some challenges, but I think it also leads to a lot of benefits, because around the same table you will have people like Camilla described me, overcommitted people with different roles, but then also bring a lot of perspectives around the table so that you get all these perspectives included in discussion. So I'll leave you with a question. Perhaps the way to high performance is to actually limit access to resources, and then you force people to be very efficient with what they have. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for your talk. We don't have a huge amount of time, but if anyone did have a burning question, you are more than welcome to stretch your legs and go up to the mic to ask that. For me, I found it a really interesting talk, Nick. Thank you for that. And I think, you know, if I was going to take one take home away, it would be that idea of understanding something really, really well, rather than sort of taking a broad brush approach to trying to get a huge range of knowledge. So, for me personally, that would be something I'll be taking away. But we have time for one question, so I'll hand it over to you.
Who drives the research? Does it come from the sport, or does it come from the Sport Norway? It's just in Scotland, we have this situation sometimes where, as sports scientists or researchers, we're interested in a certain element and we're really passionate about it and we think it'll be really great, and then we take it to the sport and they're either interested for 2 weeks or not interested at all, and it becomes really frustrating. Or they have a question for us and actually we can't answer it. We don't have the skills, the resources, the knowledge, or it just can't be answered. So in Norway, who drives that process?
It is an ongoing discussion around that very precise question. What we tried to do is we structured the research activities with basic fundamental research activities, producing longitudinal studies to answer bigger questions, and then we make sure that we have some resources available to make those quicker projects with needs that are typical to elite sports, especially where they need to have an answer within 8 weeks, otherwise they're not interested in collaborating.
Thank you for that question, and thank you again, Nick, for your talk, and to you, Alex, as well. I think, for me personally, a great start to the program.